of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word, so that I may also go and pay him homage." When they had heard the king, they set out, and there ahead of them went the star that they had seen at its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary and his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. This is the word of the Lord.
Thank you, Carol. Can I tell them about this?
Yes.
Can I tell them? Carol came in today and she said, "I don't know why I have to read all these names." And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" And she goes, "All these names of so-and-so and so-and-so's son and so-and-so's son." I'm like, "What scripture are you reading?" And it was Matthew 1 that she had instead of 2. And she had been practicing. Pronouncing. She looked up all the names, pronounced, as far as pronouncing them, and then she gets here, I'm like, I don't think the hardest word is Magi, so I don't know what you're talking about. I had to share that. Today is Epiphany. And traditionally, this is the time where we read the story of the wise men from the east, seeing the star and traveling far to come and visit Jesus and his family, and they present him gifts. And with that being said, some of you might know that the wise men are really not my favorite. I have nothing against them personally. I just don't like them in the nativity scenes. They don't belong there. And so whenever I see a nativity scene with wise men in it, I cringe a little bit. And somebody reminded me that they remembered my story from last year of how I would switch the wise men around in different nativity sets from a friend who collected nativity sets. And I said, well, I can't share that story again. And so I developed this quirk of having the wise men bothering me. I developed that a number of years ago because I found out that the wise men were probably really not there. They came later, a few years later. So I have this kind of annoyance whenever I see wise men in a nativity scene. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't want to ruin the nativity for you. I'm not bitter about the wise men. I'm not bitter that they were all men and not women. My biggest problem with the nativity is that we have tried cramming Matthew's version of Jesus' birth and Luke's version of Jesus' birth into the same story. And both of these Gospels have very different stories of Jesus' birth. And they were written for very different reasons. Matthew wrote his version for a specific reason and a specific purpose to a specific audience. And Luke wrote his version for a very specific reason, for a very specific purpose, and for a very specific people group. And in our modern minds, we have somehow morphed them and mashed them together. Luke's version of Jesus' birth had an angel appearing to Mary, telling her that she's going to have a baby. And then she sings a song. Then Mary and Joseph travel to Bethlehem to get registered. Mary goes into labor while they were there. They can't find a place to stay, and And so they end up putting Jesus in a manger. Then angels announce to shepherds that the Messiah is born in Bethlehem, so they go check it out, and they find Jesus and his family in the stable, and they tell them what happened when the angels appeared to them. Luke wanted his readers to know about Jesus as a man, as a baby. And in his gospel, he uses the words Son of Man 24 more times in his story. And that's what he wants to get across to his readers, that God came and became a man. Now, Matthew's version of Jesus' birth is a little bit different. It starts out with the genealogy of Joseph, with many, many, many names of, if you read the King James Version, there's a lot of begatting going on. So-and-so begat, so-and-so begat, so-and-so. Name after name of ancestors, including King David. Joseph finds out that Mary is pregnant. His plan was to quietly divorce her. But an angel appeared in a dream and told Joseph to marry Mary, and that the baby will save his people from their sins. And Joseph was to name this baby Jesus. Which leads to our scripture today. Because right after that passage, these wise men enter the story. Because they saw a star in the sky, they followed it, and then they started asking questions of where this new king is supposed to be, because that's what the star represented. And King Herod found out about it. And he kind of becomes scared and becomes frightened, because now there's this new king being born, and that's competition to him. And so he sends the wise men to go and find them. They show up at Joseph and Mary's house to present Jesus with expensive gifts and to worship him. Then in a dream, they're warned not to go back because Herod has bad intentions. And so they don't report back to Herod, and they go home a different way. Very different stories. And I don't like mushing them together and treating them as one story, because that was not the intent of the authors. Matthew's reason for writing was to convince his readers, who were many Jewish people, or mainly Jewish people, and that Jesus was the long-awaited Messiah that they have been waiting for. Throughout Matthew's gospel, you will see the Old Testament quoted over and over and over again. And this was to help those who were Jewish connect Jesus' story to the Old Testament story. Or in other words, the author wanted to connect Jesus' story to Torah and the prophets. He wanted his readers to see that connection and saying, Jesus is the Messiah. This is it. And the most important thing I want you to remember today is that the story that we read this morning, this passage, is the beginning of the story. It's only the beginning of the story. It's not a story that stands alone, or it's not meant to. It's meant to be read in context of the bigger story of what Matthew is trying to get through to his readers. And today, while looking at this small section of the story, of the greater story, I want to do a couple of things. I want to explore the character of King Herod, and I want to explore the characters of the wise men from the east. And so we're going to start with Herod. Historically, Herod was of Jewish descent, but he worked for Rome. Roman government ruled the area. And Rome put puppet kings in place to be on the throne. And Herod was one of these kings. He was a Jewish king, but Rome controlled him. Herod had architectural and cultural achievements during his rule. One of the many achievements that he had was that he renovated and enlarged the Jerusalem temple. And these are a few things that we know about him historically, of what we know actually really happened. This story, Matthew uses King Herod as the antithesis of Jesus, the antagonist of the story, as Herod being the king of the Jews and Jesus being the new king of the Jews. They were polar opposites of each other, and Matthew used them as opposites in the story. And it says that Herod is frightened when he hears about this birth of a new king. And when I was reading the story and preparing this sermon, I saw some words that I have never seen before. Because after it says, Herod is frightened, it also says, and all of Jerusalem with him. And I found that fascinating. It seems the author of this gospel is setting up this story and asking the question, was King Herod ready for a new king? And he wasn't, because he got frightened and he tried to protect his throne. But I think the author is also asking the question, is Jerusalem ready for Jesus, the new king of the Jews? And it seems like they're not ready either. Because knowing that this is just the first part of Matthew's gospel and his story, as we read through the chapters of the story, at the end, towards the end of the story, Jesus is crucified. And there is a sign placed above Jesus' head while hanging on the cross that read, "This is Jesus, King of the Jews." That theme runs through. And Matthew, in this story that we're reading today, is foreshadowing what is going to happen later in the story. Jerusalem wasn't ready for the new king. And Herod wasn't either. Herod ruled. Herod ruled. Jesus served. Herod feared, but Jesus loved. Herod hurt people. Jesus healed people. They stand in contrast to one another in the Gospel of Matthew's story. And it's on purpose. Now let's look at the Wisemen, or as some say Magi, or as some say kings. And I want to go through some common traits that we find. I have to show you a picture because I thought this was kind of funny. Our little projector kind of blanks out. It's a different system we're using. And so, oh, it is, right there. These are just different things that I found on the internet, and I found it fascinating because they're all very similar but different in various ways. One of the traits that I see is when we think about the story or when we see the nativities, there's always 3 wise men. And the story never says that there were 3. Could have been 2, could have been 10. We don't know. The story never says. But they're always depicted in 3s. A second thing is that they carry their individual gifts. And honestly, we don't know if they carry their own individual gifts. What we do know is that the scripture says they opened their treasures and offered Jesus gifts. And there were 3 gifts: gold and frankincense and myrrh. And then I also noticed that there's usually at least one of them bowing down at some point in time. But when we read the scripture, all of them bowed down. All of them worshipped this new King of the Jews, which is important to the story. They're worshiping the new King of the Jews. And I also noticed that at least one of them has a crown on their head. And these men, I hate to tell you this, these men were probably not kings. The Greek translation, the word is Magi, translated Magi, but it also can be translated Wisemen. Also can be translated astrologers. Also can be translated magicians. The word has nothing to do with kingship. They were most likely from Persia or Babylon, and experts in astrology, reading stars, and interpreting dreams. They were pagans. They were Gentiles. I'm going to move back now, because I feel like I'm more centered here. And
you also do a puppet with your hand.
oh, was I doing a puppet? I'll try not to talk so much with my hands. It would be interesting though, one day. I forgot where I was. Anyway, these wise men were probably pagans, Gentiles, of not, some people who were not of the Jewish descent. And it's interesting that Matthew's gospel includes pagan worshipers, Gentile worshipers, non-Jewish worshipers who recognize Jesus as the king. Herod and all Jerusalem feared. But these Gentile pagans worshipped. More foreshadowing of the rest of Matthew's story. A story written to those of a Jewish faith, to give reason for Jesus being the long-awaited Messiah that Jerusalem and Israel was not ready for. And the only people ready for him and recognized him were pagans and Gentiles. Whoever thought God would do that? No one was ready. No one had a clue that God would show up in this way. God in human form, in the man of Jesus Christ, the Messiah, carpenter. Not rich, not famous, and definitely not a Roman elected king. This was only the beginning of Matthew's story. He had a lot more to write about this baby Jesus, the King of the Jews, growing up and showing humanity what the kingdom of God is like. Matthew tells his story. Joni told me this morning, it's the Roaring 20s again. And we are bringing back the Charleston. Yes, we are. In a way, we are starting a new story. In this new year, in this new decade, a new chapter in our own lives. And God is the author of that story. As I look at the gospel of my own life, there have been many difficult times. There have been characters in my life a lot like King Herod. People who were violent, people who wanted to cause me harm, who were maybe intimidated or frightened of me, people who wanted to control me or overpower me, and maybe they did it for a little while. But this is a new chapter. And And as I look back on the previous chapters of my life, there have been many amazing times and amazing people that I am incredibly grateful for. People who were Magi. People who saw past what I was at the moment and saw what I could be. People who recognized a gift that I had inside of me waiting to be used. People who trained me and developed me and took their gifts and gave them to me. They were the Magi in my life. But when I look at my whole story so far, both the King Herods of my life and the Magi of my life grew me into the person that I have become today. Both had a hand in who God has ultimately created me to be. God used the King Herods and the Magi to teach me lessons along the way that I might not otherwise have learned. They made me strong. They made me secure, intelligent and wise. They made me sensitive and kind. They made me skeptical. They made me brave. They made me content. And my story is not done. There are more King Herods to come along. There are more Magi in the next chapters of my life. And so, too, is it with your life. There are more Herods and Magi in the next chapters of your life as well. Who were the King Herods and the Magi in your life? I guess that's my challenge for you, to think about that. Who were the King Herods? Who were the Magi? How did they grow you into the person that you have become today? And what does God have in store for you next? Our story, your story, isn't over yet either. God is developing this beautiful life, this beautiful story. And this next chapter has just begun. New year, a new decade. And God is not finished with our adventures yet. Amen.